October 24th, 1942. 2,100 hours. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone crouched in the mud behind his .30 caliber Browning machine gun, listening to the rain hammer down through the jungle canopy. Water poured off his helmet, soaked through his dungarees, turned the ground beneath him into a swamp. The darkness was absolute. No moon, no stars visible through storm clouds, just the sound of rain and the distant rumble of artillery and the closer, more ominous sound of thousands of men moving through the jungle. Japanese soldiers. Thousands of them, coming straight at John's position. John was 25 years old, a kid from Buffalo, New York, who had enlisted in the Marines 9 months earlier because he was bored working as a golf caddy. Now he commanded a machine gun section on Guadalcanal. 15 Marines, 2 Browning M1917 water-cooled .30 caliber machine guns, and orders to hold a narrow corridor that led directly to Henderson Field, the only operational American airfield in the Solomon Islands. If Henderson Field fell, the entire Guadalcanal campaign would collapse. The Japanese would control the Solomons. American forces would be pushed back across the Pacific. Everything the Marines had fought for over the past 3 months would be lost. The Japanese knew this. That's why they were sending an entire regiment, over 3,000 soldiers from elite Sendai Division, directly at the weakest point in the Marine perimeter, directly at John Basilone's position. John had 2 machine guns, 15 men. Most of them were teenagers who had never been in combat before tonight. Some had been on Guadalcanal for less than a week. They were scared, exhausted, sick with malaria and dysentery, and about to face the largest Japanese attack of the Guadalcanal campaign. John checked his guns one more time. Both were loaded, belts of ammunition fed into the receivers, water jackets filled. Spare barrels nearby in case the primaries overheated. He had positioned the guns to create interlocking fields of fire across the approaches to his position. Any Japanese soldier trying to advance through the kill zone would be caught in crossfire from both guns. It was a good defensive position. But John knew it wouldn't be enough. Not against 3,000 soldiers. Not for an entire night. He looked at his Marines. Kids, really, barely old enough to shave, and saw the fear in their eyes. They knew what was coming. They could hear it in the jungle. The sound of thousands of men moving closer. Battle cries in Japanese. Officers shouting commands. John lit a cigarette, violating blackout discipline, not caring, and said to his gunners, "Remember your training. Short bursts. Don't let the barrels overheat. And no matter what happens, keep shooting. We hold this position, or we die here." One of the young Marines asked, "Sergeant, what if they break through?" John took a drag on his cigarette and replied, "Then we fight them with our bare hands. But they're not breaking through. Not tonight." At 2,100 hours, Japanese artillery began falling on Marine positions across the Henderson Field perimeter. To understand what John Basilone did on the night of October 24th to 25th, 1942, you must understand who he was and how he became a Marine who could hold against impossible odds. John Basilone was born on November 4th, 1916, in Buffalo, New York, in the middle of a snowstorm that shut down the city for 3 days. His mother, Theodora Bencivenga, always said that John came into the world fighting against the storm, a metaphor that would define his life. John was the 6th of 10 children born to Salvatore and Theodora Basilone, Italian immigrants who had come to America in 1903 seeking opportunity, and finding instead poverty, prejudice, and backbreaking work. Salvatore was a tailor who worked 16-hour days in a sweatshop, earning barely enough to feed his growing family. Theodora raised the children, stretched every dollar, and held the family together through the brutal Buffalo winters and the grinding poverty of immigrant life in the 1920s. The Basilone family lived in a cramped 3-room apartment in Buffalo's First Ward, a neighborhood packed with Italian, Polish, and Irish immigrants. 10 children sleeping 3 or 4 to a bed. No hot water. A coal stove for heat. Outdoor plumbing until John was 12 years old. Dinner was often just bread and beans or pasta with a little tomato sauce. Meat was a luxury save for Sunday dinner, if they could afford it all. John's childhood was a mix of poverty, street life, and the fierce pride of Italian immigrant culture. He spoke Italian before he spoke English. He attended St. Bernard's parochial school, where the nuns taught with rulers and the priests preached obedience, duty, and the fear of God. John was a mediocre student. He could read and write, but had no interest in academics. What he loved was action, competition, physical challenges. By age 10, John was fighting in the streets. Not because he was a bully. Friends described him as good-natured and loyal, but because fighting was how you survived in the First Ward. Irish kids fought Italian kids. Polish kids fought everyone. John Basilone, small for his age but fast and fearless, earned respect by never backing down. He took beatings and gave beatings. He learned that pain was temporary, but quitting lasted forever. At age 13, John got his first job, delivering newspapers before school. He gave his wages to his mother. By 14, he was working after school at a laundry, running a pressing machine. By 15, he had dropped out of school entirely and was working full-time in his father's tailor shop, learning to cut fabric and sew seams. The work was tedious, repetitive, soul-crushing. John lasted 2 years. In 1934, at age 18, John Basilone walked into an Army recruiting office in downtown Buffalo and enlisted. He didn't tell his parents first. He just signed the papers, took the oath, and left Buffalo on a train bound for basic training at Fort Jay, New York. His mother cried when she found out. His father was furious. He needed John's labor in the shop, but John was gone and he wasn't coming back. The Army sent Private John Basilone to the Philippines in 1935, assigned to the 31st Infantry Regiment stationed at Fort McKinley near Manila. For John, the Philippines was paradise compared to Buffalo. The weather was hot and humid, a welcome change from Buffalo winters. The people were friendly, curious about the young American soldiers. Manila was exotic, vibrant, full of life and color and opportunity for adventure. John loved everything about it. He became a fixture in Manila's boxing scene. The Army organized regimental boxing tournaments, and John, 5'8", 180 pounds, with quick hands and an iron jaw, won fight after fight. He wasn't the most skilled boxer, but he was the toughest. He could take punches that would drop other fighters and keep coming forward. Filipino locals started calling him Manila John because he fought like a Filipino, aggressive, relentless, never giving up. But John's real talent was machine guns. The Army trained John as a machine gunner on the Browning M1917 water-cooled .30 caliber machine gun, a World War I-era weapon that was still the Army's standard heavy machine gun in the 1930s. The M1917 was a complex weapon, belt-fed, water-cooled, requiring constant maintenance and a thorough understanding of how the mechanism worked. Jams were common if the gun wasn't properly maintained. Overheating was a constant problem during sustained fire. John became an expert. He could disassemble and reassemble an M1917 blindfolded. He understood intuitively how to set up fields of fire, how to position guns for maximum effect, how to control rates of fire to conserve ammunition and prevent overheating. His instructors said he had a natural feel for machine guns. He could sense when a jam was about to occur and clear it before it happened. He could hear subtle changes in the gun's rhythm that indicated problems with the ammunition feed or the water cooling system. John spent 3 years in the Philippines, boxing and mastering machine guns, and living a life far removed from Buffalo's tenements. He sent money home to his mother. He made friends among the Filipino locals. He fell in love with a Filipino girl named Maria. Nothing serious, just young love that faded when John's enlistment ended. In 1937, John's service obligation ended. The Army offered to re-enlist him, but John declined. He wanted to see his family. He wanted to experience civilian life. He returned to the United States and settled with his parents, who had moved to Raritan, New Jersey, a small town about 40 miles southwest of New York City. John needed work. The Great Depression was ending, but jobs were still scarce, especially for a young man with no education beyond 8th grade and no skills except boxing and machine guns. John found work as a golf caddy at the Raritan Valley Country Club, carrying golf bags for wealthy businessmen and bankers who played the manicure course while John walked behind them in the summer heat. The work was fine. The pay was adequate. John was good at it. He learned the course, understood the game, made good tips. But he was bored. After the excitement of Manila, after the camaraderie of the Army, after the adrenaline of boxing matches, carrying golf bags felt meaningless. For 4 years, John Basilone worked as a caddy. He lived with his parents. He dated local girls. He went to church on Sundays. He boxed in amateur competitions in New York and New Jersey. He saved money and thought about buying a car or maybe starting a small business. It was a stable life, predictable and safe. John hated every minute of it. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, John was at the country club preparing for a busy Sunday of caddying when he heard the news. Japanese aircraft had attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Over 2,400 Americans killed. The Pacific Fleet crippled. America was at war. John's reaction was immediate. He walked off the golf course, went home, and told his mother he was enlisting. She begged him not to go. She had already lost family members in the Great War. She couldn't bear to lose a son. But John had made up his mind. On December 8, 1941, one day after Pearl Harbor, John walked into a Marine Corps recruiting office in Baltimore, Maryland. He was 25 years old, older than most recruits. The recruiter asked why he wanted to enlist in the Marines instead of re-enlisting the Army, where he already had experience. John said, "I was a soldier. Now I want to be a Marine. I've heard the Marines are the toughest fighters. I want to be one of them." The Marines accepted him immediately. The Corps was expanding rapidly for war in the Pacific and needed experienced men. John's Army service in the Philippines and his machine gun expertise made him valuable. But there was a complication. The Marine Corps had different machine gun doctrine than the Army. The Marines used the same M1917 Browning, but they employed it differently, more aggressively, more focused on offensive fire support rather than defensive positions. John would have to go through Marine machine gun school. John didn't mind. He loved machine guns. At Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, he went through the course and quickly proved he was one of the best natural machine gunners the instructors had ever seen. His Army experience showed. He understood the weapons at a level that couldn't be taught. He felt them, sensed their moods, knew instinctively how to get maximum performance. By May 1942, John had been promoted as sergeant and assigned to the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division. The division was training for deployment to the Pacific. Rumors circulated that they'd be going into combat soon, that the Marines were planning an offensive operation somewhere in the South Pacific. John couldn't wait. After 4 years of boredom in New Jersey, he was finally going to war. In July 1942, the 1st Marine Division boarded transport ships at Norfolk, Virginia, and sailed south through the Panama Canal and then west across the Pacific Ocean. Their destination was classified. Most Marines didn't know where they were going until days before the landing. The target was Guadalcanal, a jungle-covered island in the Solomon Islands chain northeast of Australia. Japanese forces had landed on Guadalcanal in June 1942 and were building an airfield. If the Japanese completed the airfield, their aircraft would dominate the South Pacific, threatening Allied shipping lanes to Australia and New Zealand. The American plan was simple. Land Marines on Guadalcanal, seize the airfield before it became operational, and hold it against Japanese counterattacks. Intelligence estimated that about 2,000 Japanese troops were on the island, mostly construction workers and engineers, with minimal combat forces. Intelligence was wrong. On August 7, 1942, at dawn, the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Guadalcanal in the first major American offensive operation of World War II. John Basilone waded through the surf carrying his machine gun, expecting fierce resistance. Instead, the landing was unopposed. The Japanese construction workers fled into the jungle. The Marines captured the partially completed airfield, renamed Henderson Field after a Marine pilot killed at Midway, without firing a shot. For 3 days, the Marines dug in and fortified Henderson Field, while engineers completed the airstrip. The Japanese seemed to have abandoned the island. Some Marines thought the operation would be easy, that they'd be rotated home within weeks. On August 8th, everything changed. A Japanese naval task force surprised the Allied fleet covering the Marine landings and sank 4 cruisers in the Battle of Savo Island, one of the worst naval defeats in U.S. Navy history. The surviving Allied ships retreated, leaving the Marines on Guadalcanal stranded without naval support and with only half their supplies unloaded. The Marines were stuck. They held Henderson Field and a narrow perimeter around it, surrounded by jungle and facing an enemy that was bringing reinforcements onto the island nightly via fast destroyer runs nicknamed the Tokyo Express. Over the next 2 months, the situation deteriorated. The Marines faced constant attacks from Japanese forces in the jungle. Supplies were critically low. Food was rationed to 2 meals a day, then 1. Marines ate captured Japanese rice. Many contracted malaria, dysentery, and tropical diseases. The constant rain, heat, and jungle conditions broke down equipment and men. John Basilone's machine gun section was positioned on the southern perimeter, covering one of the main approaches to Henderson Field. They dug deep foxholes, sandbagged their positions, cleared fields of fire, and waited. The waiting was harder than combat. Sitting in mud, swatting mosquitoes, hearing Japanese soldiers in the jungle, not knowing when the next attack would come. Some Marines cracked under strain. Others just endured. John kept his men focused on the machine guns. They maintained the weapons religiously, cleaning, oiling, testing, repositioning. John trained his gunners constantly, running them through drills even when they were exhausted. He knew that when the attack came, only the machine guns would save them. By mid-October, Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were massing forces for a major offensive. Radio intercepts suggested that 2 Japanese divisions were on the island, over 20,000 soldiers. The plan was to attack the Marine perimeter from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelm the defenders, and recapture Henderson Field. The Marines prepared for the worst. On October 23, 1942, John Basilone's section commander called him to the command post. The commander, Captain Lou Chesty Puller, was a legend in the Marine Corps, tough, profane, fearless. Puller looked at John and said, "Basilone, you're the best machine gunner I've got. Tomorrow night, the Japs are coming with everything they have. Your section is holding the corridor approach to Henderson Field. If they break through your position, we lose the airfield and the campaign. I need you to hold." John replied, "We'll hold, sir. They're not getting through." Puller nodded. "I know you will. That's why I'm putting you there. Good luck, Marine." John returned to his section and gathered his men. He told them what was coming. Thousands of Japanese soldiers attacking their position. He saw the fear in their eyes. Some of them were 19 years old, farm kids from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, and they were about to face the fight of their lives. John said, "Listen to me. Tomorrow night, we hold. I don't care how many Japs come at us. I don't care if they're standing on top of each other. We keep shooting until they're all dead or we're dead. There's no retreat. There's no surrender. We hold." One of the young Marines asked, "Sergeant, what if we run out of ammunition?" John replied, "Then I'll go get more. Just keep those guns firing." The evening of October 24th, 1942, started with rain. Not ordinary rain. Torrential tropical rain that turned the jungle into a swamp and reduced visibility to a few feet. The Marines in John Basilone's section huddled in their foxholes, trying to stay dry, failing. At 2,000 hours, Japanese artillery began falling on the Marine perimeter. The bombardment was heavier than anything the Marines had experienced on Guadalcanal. Shells exploded across the defensive positions, tearing through jungle, collapsing foxholes, killing and wounding Marines. The bombardment lasted for over an hour. Then it stopped, in the sudden silence. The Marines could hear something else, the sound of thousands of men moving through the jungle, the sound of equipment. Commands shouted in Japanese. And then, at approximately 2,100 hours, the battle cry, "Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!" 3,000 voices screaming as the Japanese Sendai Division charged. John Basilone's machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The 2 M1917 Brownings hammered out .30 caliber rounds at 450 rounds per minute each, 900 bullets every 60 seconds, cutting through the jungle like invisible scythes. Tracer rounds, every 5th bullet glowing red, drew lines of fire through the darkness. The Japanese came in waves. The first wave hit the machine gun fire and was shredded. Men fell, screaming, bodies piling up at the edge of the kill zone. The second wave came over the bodies of the first. They were cut down too. John's gunners were firing in short, controlled bursts, 3 to 5 second bursts, then releasing the trigger to prevent overheating. But the targets were so dense that even short bursts found multiple victims. The Japanese weren't taking cover. They were charging straight into the fire, accepting horrific casualties, believing that their superior numbers would overwhelm the Marines. After 15 minutes of continuous fire, one of John's guns jammed. Machine gun jams are catastrophic in combat. A jammed gun is a dead gun. And with thousands of Japanese soldiers charging, a dead gun means the defensive line collapses. The gunner, a 20-year-old kid from Tennessee named Private First Class Nash Phillips, frantically tried to clear the jam. His hand was shaking. He couldn't see what he was doing in the darkness. The Japanese were 30 yards away and closing. John Basilone ran to the gun. In the chaos of battle, explosions, screaming, machine gun fire, rain, John assessed the problem instantly. The gun had a double feed. 2 rounds trying to enter the chamber simultaneously. John grabbed the barrel with his bare hands to stabilize it while he cleared the jam. The barrel had been firing for 15 minutes straight. Even with the water jacket cooling system, it was over 300 degrees Fahrenheit. John's hands blistered and burned instantly. The pain was overwhelming, like grabbing a stove burner with bare hands. But John held on, cleared the jam, loaded a new belt, and got the gun firing again. His hands were ruined, blistered, blackened, some skin burned off. For the rest of the night, John would fight with hands so damaged he could barely hold a weapon. But he kept fighting. By 22:30 hours, 90 minutes into battle, John's section had been fighting continuously. They had fired thousands of rounds. The machine gun barrels were glowing red, even with the water cooling. The water in the water jackets was boiling, literally boiling, steam venting from the cooling systems. One of John's Marines was killed. Private Robert Powell, hit by a Japanese grenade. Another was wounded by shrapnel. The section was down to 13 men. The Japanese launched another wave. This one was different. The soldiers weren't just charging. They were using fire and maneuver tactics, some soldiers shooting while others advanced. They reached the Marine foxholes. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted. John dropped his machine gun and drew his M19 11.45 caliber pistol. He shot Japanese soldiers at point-blank range as they climbed into the defensive positions. One Japanese soldier bayoneted a Marine 3 feet from John. John shot the soldier through the head, then turned and shot another soldier trying to bayonet him. The Marines threw grenades. The Japanese threw grenades back. Explosions in the confined space of the foxholes. Men screaming. The smell of blood and explosives and burning flesh. For 5 minutes, it was pure chaos. Desperate close quarters combat in darkness and rain and mud. Then the Japanese pulled back, leaving more bodies in the Marine positions. John did a quick count. Down to 11 Marines. 4 dead. 2 wounded badly enough they couldn't fight. Ammunition running low. And the Japanese were regrouping for another attack. At midnight, 3 hours into the battle, John's section was nearly out of ammunition. The machine guns had fired over 10,000 rounds. The ammunition bearers had made multiple trips back to the supply point, but the supply point was itself running low. Without ammunition, the machine guns were useless. Without the machine guns, the Japanese would overrun the position. If they overran John's position, they'd break through to Henderson Field. If Henderson Field fell, Guadalcanal was lost. John made a decision that would define his legend. He would go get more ammunition himself. He grabbed 2 ammunition belts, each belt weighing approximately 50 pounds, slung them over his shoulders, and prepared to move out of the foxhole. One of his Marines asked, "Sergeant, where are you going?" John replied, "To get more ammo. Keep shooting. I'll be back." Then John Basilone crawled out his foxhole into no man's land, into the darkness between American and Japanese positions, where thousands of enemy soldiers were moving through jungle, where discovery meant certain death. The ammunition supply point was about 200 yards behind John's position. Under normal circumstances, 200 yards is a short walk. But nothing about this night was normal. The jungle between John's position and the supply point was filled with Japanese soldiers. Some of them infiltrators trying to get behind Marine lines, others just disoriented and lost in the darkness. Japanese and American positions were so intermixed that no one could tell who controlled what ground. John crawled on his belly through mud, moving slowly, trying not to make noise. He could hear Japanese soldiers talking just feet away. He could hear wounded Marines crying for help. Men from other sections who had been overrun, now lying in no man's land dying. John couldn't help them. If he revealed his position, he'd be killed, and then his section would have no ammunition. Halfway to the supply point, John literally crawled over a dead Japanese soldier. In the darkness, he couldn't tell it was a body until his hand sank into the corpse's abdomen. John froze, fighting the urge to vomit, waiting to see if anyone had heard him. Silence. John kept crawling. He reached the ammunition supply point, a tent surrounded by sandbags where Marines were frantically distributing ammunition to runners. John identified himself, loaded up with as much ammunition as he could carry, over 100 pounds, and began to crawl back. This time, he wasn't alone. A Japanese soldier stepped on John's hand in the darkness. John held his breath, lying perfectly still, praying the soldier would keep walking. The soldier stood there for several seconds. John could hear him breathing, could hear him shifting his weight, and then moved on. John waited 30 seconds, then crawled forward. He made it back to his position and delivered the ammunition. His Marines loaded the belts into machine guns and resumed firing. John rested for 5 minutes, then made the trip again, and then again. Over the course of the night, John Basilone made 3 round trips from his foxhole to the supply point and back, crawling through Japanese-controlled jungle, carrying over 100 pounds of ammunition each trip. Years later, Marines who had been in the section said that John's ammunition run saved them. Without the ammunition, the guns would have fallen silent. The Japanese would have overrun the position. Every Marine in the section owed his life to John's willingness to crawl through hell to keep them supplied. At 0300 hours, 6 hours into battle. John's section was barely holding. They had been fighting continuously for 6 hours. The machine guns were so hot that the barrels were deforming. The water jackets had to be refilled every 30 minutes with water brought from a stream behind the position. The gunners had burns on their hands and faces from handling the hot weapons. 7 Marines were still fighting. 8 were dead or wounded, and the Japanese were still coming. The next attack was the heaviest yet. The Japanese came in a human wave. Hundreds of soldiers charging simultaneously, believing that sheer numbers would overwhelm the defenders. John's machine guns fired without stopping, belt after belt of ammunition. The barrels were glowing white-hot. The sound was continuous, not individual shots, but a sustained roar of gunfire. The Japanese reached the Marine positions again. Again, hand-to-hand combat in the foxholes. John was out of pistol ammunition. He grabbed a rifle from a dead Marine and used it as a club, swinging it like a baseball bat, breaking bones and skulls. A Japanese officer with a samurai sword attacked John. The officer swung the sword at John's head. John blocked with the rifle, the sword cutting into the wood. John twisted the rifle, disarming the officer, then beat him to death with the rifle, but more Japanese soldiers came over the edge of the foxhole. John fought them with his burned hands, his rifle club, and pure rage. He killed 3 more before the attack broke. At 0500 hours, as dawn approached, the Japanese launched their final assault. They knew daylight would expose them to more accurate Marine fire. This was their last chance. Over 1,000 Japanese soldiers attacked John's section simultaneously. The machine guns fired until the barrels literally melted. The sustained fire was so intense that the barrel's steel softened and deformed, rendering the guns inoperable. With the machine guns down, John and his surviving Marines fought with rifles, pistols, grenades, and eventually with their bare hands. The Japanese swarmed the position. For 10 minutes, it was a savage close-quarters brawl. Then, finally, the Japanese broke. As dawn light filtered through the jungle, the surviving Japanese soldiers retreated, leaving hundreds of dead behind. They had thrown everything at John Basilone's section, thousands of soldiers, wave after wave, for 8 straight hours, and failed to break through. When relief forces arrived at John's position at 0600 hours, they found carnage. 38 dead Japanese soldiers were piled directly in front of the 2 machine gun positions. More bodies were scattered across the approaches, estimated at over 200 within 100 yards of the foxholes. Blood trails led back into the jungle where more wounded and dead Japanese had been dragged by their comrades. Based on Japanese after-action reports captured later, historians estimated that John Basilone's 2 machine guns killed between 300 and 400 Japanese soldiers during the night of October 24th to 25th, 1942. No one will ever know the exact number, but it was enough to shatter the Japanese attack, enough to save Henderson Field, enough to turn the tide of the Guadalcanal campaign. Of the 15 Marines who had manned John's section at the start of the night, only 3 were alive and unwounded by dawn: John Basilone and 2 gunners. 8 were dead, 4 were wounded. John's hands were so badly burned that he couldn't close them into fists. His uniform was soaked in blood, most of it not his own. He had fired, by his estimate, over 15,000 rounds of ammunition. He had killed Japanese soldiers with machine guns, pistols, rifles, and his bare hands. He had crawled through enemy lines 3 times to resupply ammunition. He had fought for 8 straight hours without rest, without pause, without retreating. When his commanding officer, Captain Chesty Puller, arrived at the position and saw the dead Japanese, he asked John, "How many do you think you got, Basilone?" John replied, "I don't know, sir. I just kept shooting." Puller said, "You're getting the Medal of Honor for this. You know that, don't you?" John said, "I was just doing my job, sir." Puller shook his head. "No, Marine, you did something no one else could have done. You held when any other section would have broken. You saved this airfield." Act 3. The Hero Who Refused Safety, 1943 to 1944. The recommendation for John Basilone's Medal of Honor was submitted by Captain Puller in November 1942. It slowly worked its way up the chain of command through the bureaucracy of military decorations. Meanwhile, John remained on Guadalcanal with the 7th Marines, fighting in the jungle, patrolling, and holding defensive positions. The worst of the fighting was over. The October attacks had broken Japanese strength on the island, but combat continued through December 1942 and into January 1943. John contracted malaria in November 1942. The disease was endemic on Guadalcanal. Over half the Marines on the island had it. Malaria causes high fevers, chills, exhaustion, and hallucinations. John was sick for 2 weeks, bedridden, barely able to move, but he refused evacuation. He stayed with his section, leading from a cot when he was too weak to stand. In December 1942, the 7 Marines were rotated off Guadalcanal and sent to Australia for rest, re-equipping, and replacement of casualties. John Basilone sailed from Guadalcanal, having fought there for 4 months, survived the worst battle of the campaign, and lost 8 Marines from his section who he'd never forget. In Australia, John and the Marines spent 3 months recovering. They received new uniforms, new equipment, hot meals, and medical care. It was the first time in months they hadn't been fighting or preparing to fight. John wrote letters home to his family, the first letters they received from him since August. He didn't mention Guadalcanal, didn't describe what he'd done. He just said he was fine, the Marines were fine, and he'd be home when the war was over. He didn't know that his life was about to change completely. In March 1943, John was summoned to headquarters and told that he had been awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. The ceremony would be held in Australia, with General Douglas MacArthur presiding. On September 21, 1943, at a ceremony in Melbourne, Australia, John Basilone stood at attention, while Major General Alexander Vandergrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, read the citation. For extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action against enemy Japanese forces, above and beyond the call of duty, while serving with the 1st Battalion, 7 Marines, 1st Marine Division in the Lunga area, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, on October 24th and 25th, 1942. While the enemy was hammering at the Marines' defensive positions, Sergeant Basilone, in charge of 2 sections of heavy machine guns, fought valiantly to check the savage and determined assault. In a fierce frontal attack with the Japanese blasting his guns with grenades and mortar fire, one of Sergeant Basilone's sections, with its gun crews, was put out of action, leaving only 2 men able to carry on. Moving an extra gun into position, he placed it in action, then, under continual fire, repaired another and personally manned it, gallantly holding his line until replacement arrived. A little later, with ammunition critically low and the supply lines cut off, Sergeant Basilone, at great risk of his life and in the face of continued enemy attack, battled his way through hostile lines with urgently needed shells for his gunners, thereby contributing in large measure to the virtual annihilation of a Japanese regiment. Vandergrift placed the Medal of Honor around John's neck. John stood there uncomfortable in the spotlight, wanting nothing more than to return to his unit. Instead, the Marines had other plans for Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone. The United States government needed heroes in 1943. The war was going well. Guadalcanal secured, North Africa liberated. Italy invaded, but it was far from over. Public morale needed boosting. War bond drives needed celebrity draw. Americans needed inspiration. John Basilone was perfect for the role. He was young, handsome in his dress blues, humble, and a genuine Medal of Honor recipient. More importantly, he was Italian-American, important for a government trying to maintain support among Italian immigrants while fighting Italy. In October 1943, John was ordered back to the United States for a war bond tour. He protested. He wanted to stay with his Marines, return to combat. His commanders told him it wasn't a request. It was an order. The nation needed him at home more than it needed him in the Pacific. John reluctantly obeyed. The war bond tour was a whirlwind. John traveled from city to city, appearing at massive rallies where thousands of people came to see the Medal of Honor recipient. He gave speeches, short, simple, talked about the Marines, about Guadalcanal, about the importance of supporting the troops. He hated public speaking, but he did it because it was his duty. The tour took John to New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and dozens of smaller cities. The crowds were enormous. Tens of thousands of people at some rallies. John would appear on stage in his dress blues, the Medal of Honor visible on his chest, and the crowd would erupt in applause. Movie stars appeared alongside him. Politicians gave speeches praising his heroism. Bands played patriotic music. John found it all deeply uncomfortable. He didn't feel like a hero. He had just done what any Marine would have done, held his position, kept his men alive, followed orders. The 8 Marines who had died in his section on Guadalcanal, those were the real heroes, John thought. They'd given everything. He had just survived, but he played his role. He shook thousands of hands. He signed autographs. He posed for photographs with children, elderly women, pretty girls in patriotic dresses. He toured factories where workers built ships and planes and weapons. He visited hospitals where wounded veterans were recovering, and he raised money, enormous amounts of money. By January 1944, John Basilone's war bond tour had raised over $1.4 million, equivalent to approximately $25 million in today's currency. The money funded ships, aircraft, weapons, and supplies that would save countless American lives. But John hated every minute of it. He wrote to friends still fighting in the Pacific and said, "I'd rather be back there with you guys and doing this circus act." In June 1944, while John was appearing at a war bond rally at Camp Pendleton in California, something happened that changed his life. He met Lena Mae Ridgey. Lena was a sergeant in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, part of the Women Marines, who had been recruited starting in 1943 to fill non-combat roles and free up male Marines for combat duty. Lena was 29 years old, beautiful, intelligent, and as dedicated to Marine Corps as any man. She was working at Camp Pendleton as a field cook when she was assigned to help organize the war bond rally. When John Basilone arrived for the event, Lena was part of the greeting committee. John saw her and was immediately smitten. Lena later said that John's first words to her were, "You're the most beautiful Marine I've ever seen." She laughed and told him that was a terrible line. John blushed, stammered, and asked if he could take her to dinner after the rally. Lena said yes. Their first date was at a small Italian restaurant in Oceanside, California, near Camp Pendleton. They talked for hours. Both were Italian, John from Buffalo, Lena from Portland, Oregon. Both came from working-class immigrant families. Both had joined the Marines out of patriotic duty. Both loved the Corps with an intensity that civilians couldn't understand. By the end of dinner, John knew he wanted to marry her. He courted her intensely over the next month. Every free moment, he was with Lena. They went to movies. They walked on the beach. They attended Mass together. Both were devout Catholics. They talked about everything: families, childhoods, the war, what they wanted after the war was over. After just 5 weeks of dating, John asked Lena to marry him. It was sudden, impulsive, but John had learned on Guadalcanal that life was short and you couldn't waste time. Lena said yes immediately. On July 10th, 1944, John Basilone and Lena Ridgey were married at St. Mary's Star of the Sea Church in Oceanside, California. It was a military wedding. John wore his Marine dress blues with the Medal of Honor prominently displayed. Lena wore a simple white wedding dress that she'd bought with her own savings. The church was packed with Marines from Camp Pendleton. John's family had traveled from New Jersey, his mother, father, and several siblings. Lena's family came from Oregon. The ceremony was traditional Catholic, Latin prayers, communion, the exchange of vows. When the priest asked John, "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" John's voice cracked with emotion as he said, "I do." When Lena said, "I do," she was crying. The reception was held at the Camp Pendleton Officers Club, a special dispensation, since John was an enlisted Marine. There was a cake, champagne, dancing, and speeches. Marines gave toasts praising John's heroism and Lena's courage for marrying him. Someone joked, "She must be the bravest person here, marrying a machine gunner." Everyone laughed. Lena laughed too, though she was thinking, "I'm marrying a man who might not come home." John and Lena spent their brief honeymoon at a small inn in Laguna Beach, about 30 miles from Camp Pendleton. They had 5 days together, 5 days of walking on the beach, talking about their future, making plans for after the war. They talked about having children. Lena wanted 4. John said 6, like a good Italian family. They talked about where they live. Maybe New Jersey near John's family. Maybe Oregon near Lena's. They talked about jobs. John thought maybe he'd become a police officer or work construction. Lena wanted to open a restaurant. They talked about everything except the one thing that hung over them like a shadow. John was going back to combat. John had a secret he'd been keeping from Lena until after the wedding. Before he'd even met her, he had submitted a request to return to combat duty. He had asked to be assigned to a combat unit in the Pacific, specifically requesting to serve as an enlisted Marine, not as an officer, not in a training role, but as a frontline machine gun section leader. The Marines had tried to talk him out of it. Officers had offered John every alternative: a commission as a lieutenant, an instructor position at a stateside base, a permanent assignment to recruiting duty, even a role in Marine Corps public affairs. Any of these positions would guarantee that John survived the war. He'd be safe, comfortable, honored, and alive. John refused everything. His reasoning was simple and unyielding. "I can't ask Marines to fight if I'm not willing to fight myself. I'm a plain soldier. I want to be with my boys." The argument that moved no one more than Chesty Puller himself, now a colonel, tried to convince John. You've done your part, Basilone. You earned the Medal of Honor. You've raised millions in war bonds. You don't need to prove anything else. If you go back and get killed, you'll hurt morale more than you'll help it. John replied, Sir, with respect, I can't be a symbol if I take the easy way out. Every Marine knows I could stay home safe. If I do that, what does it say? That once you're a hero, you're done? That your brothers can die, but you get to live because you got a medal? That's not what the Medal of Honor means. It means you lead from the front. Always. Puller had no answer to that. He approved John's request. When John told Lena he was going back to combat, she was in their hotel room in Laguna Beach on the third day of their honeymoon. She had been folding laundry, John's uniforms, when he said quietly, Lena, I have to tell you something. I'm shipping out. I requested to go back. Lena stopped folding. She turned to look at him. When? December, probably. I've been assigned to the 5th Marine Division. They're training for an operation. I don't know where yet. Lena sat down on the bed. She didn't cry. She was too strong for that, too much a Marine herself. But her voice shook. You could have stayed home. They would have let you stay. I know. You could have been safe. We could have had a life. We could have had children. I know. Then why? John sat next to her and took her hands. Because I'm a Marine. Because there are kids out there 19 years old going to combat for the first time, and they need someone who's been there before. Because I can't live with myself knowing I took the safe job while they're dying. Because his voice broke. Because it's who I am, Lena. It's who you married. Lena was silent for a long time. Then she said, Promise me you'll come back. John said, I promise I'll try. They held each other in that hotel room, both knowing it was a promise John might not be able to keep. The remaining 2 days of their honeymoon were bittersweet. They tried to be happy, tried to enjoy their time together, but the shadow of John's deployment hung over everything. They took photographs, dozens of them, wanting to preserve every moment. They walked on the beach at sunset. They went to Mass and prayed together. On July 15th, they returned to Camp Pendleton. Lena went back to her duties as a field cook. John reported to 5th Marine Division and began training with his new unit. For the next 4 months, John trained intensely. The 5th Division was newly formed, filled with young Marines who had never seen combat. John was assigned as a gunnery sergeant in command of a machine gun platoon, 30 Marines and 6 machine guns. He trained them relentlessly. He taught them everything he knew, how to set up fields of fire, how to maintain the guns, how to clear jams, how to move under fire, how to work as a team. He ran them through drills until they could perform them in their sleep. He was hard on them, demanding, uncompromising, but fair. The young Marines respected him. They knew he had earned the Medal of Honor on Guadalcanal. They knew he was the real deal. John saw Lena every chance he got, stolen hours between training exercises, weekends when he could get a pass. Every moment together was precious because both knew the clock was ticking down. In November 1944, the 5th Marine Division received orders. They were shipping out. The destination was classified, but rumors said it was a major operation, bigger than Guadalcanal, possibly the largest Marine operation of the war. The target was Iwo Jima. On December 27, 1944, John Basilone boarded a troopship in San Diego Harbor. Lena was on the dock, waving, trying not to cry. Thousands of Marines were boarding ships. The entire 5th Division, plus elements of the 3rd and 4th Divisions. Over 70,000 Marines heading west across the Pacific. John stood at the ship's rail, watching Lena get smaller and smaller as the ship pulled away from the dock. He waved until he couldn't see her anymore. Then he went below deck to his quarters, sat on his bunk, and let himself cry for the first and only time. He had a terrible feeling he'd never see Lena again. The troopship carrying John Basilone and the 5th Marine Division arrived at Saipan in the Mariana Islands in mid-January 1945. Saipan had been captured by Marines 6 months earlier and was now a major American base for operations against Japan. At Saipan, the Marines received their final briefing on the target, Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is a volcanic island roughly 760 miles south of Tokyo. It's about 8 square miles in size, 5 miles long, 2.5 miles wide at its widest point. The island is dominated by Mount Suribachi, a 550-foot extinct volcano at the southern tip. The island's name means Sulphur Island in Japanese. The volcanic soil produces sulfur that give the island a distinctive smell. Strategically, Iwo Jima was critical. The Japanese had built 3 airfields on the island. Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima could intercept American B-29 bombers flying from the Marianas to bomb Japan. If America captured Iwo Jima, those airfields could be used for American fighters to escort the bombers and for damaged bombers to make emergency landings on the return trip from Japan. The Japanese knew this. They had fortified Iwo Jima more heavily than any other island in the Pacific. Over 21,000 Japanese troops were dug into an elaborate network of tunnels, caves, bunkers, and pillboxes across the island. The commanding officer, General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, was one of Japan's best tacticians. He had ordered his troops to abandon the traditional banzai charge tactics that had failed on Guadalcanal and other islands. Instead, every position would be defended to the death from fortified cover. The Japanese would make the Americans pay in blood for every yard of ground. American intelligence estimated that Iwo Jima could be captured in 5 days. Intelligence was wrong. The battle would last 36 days and become one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. The invasion was scheduled for February 19th, 1945. The plan was for 3 Marine divisions to land simultaneously on the southeastern beaches. The 4th Division on the right, 5th Division on the left, 3rd Division in reserve. The immediate objective was to capture the beaches, push inland, and cut the island in two by reaching the opposite coast. Then the divisions would turn, 4th Division north toward the airfields, 5th Division south toward Mount Suribachi. John Basilone's unit, 1st Battalion, 27 Marines, 5th Division, would land in the 5th Wave on Red Beach 2, on the southern end of the landing zone near Mount Suribachi. On the morning of February 19th, John woke at 0400 hours on the troop ship. He ate breakfast, steak and eggs, the traditional pre-invasion meal for Marines. He checked his gear, rifle, pistol, grenades, combat knife canteen, first aid kit, entrenching tool. He helped his machine gun crews prepare their weapons, breaking down the M1917 Brownings, checking the tripods, counting ammunition belts. At 0645 hours, the naval bombardment began. 8 battleships, for heavy cruisers, and multiple destroyers opened fire on Iwo Jima. The bombardment was the heaviest pre-invasion barrage in Pacific War history. Thousands of shells, ranging from 5-inch destroyer shells to 16-inch battleship shells, pounded the island. Aircraft from escort carriers bombed and strafed Japanese positions. The island disappeared under smoke and dust. Marines watching from the troop ships thought nothing could survive that bombardment. Some officers predicted light resistance. They were wrong. The Japanese had built their fortifications deep underground. The bombardment barely touched them. At 0900 hours, the first wave of Marines hit the beaches. John's battalion was in the 5th Wave, scheduled to land at 0930 hours. John climbed down cargo nets into a landing craft, an LVT, landing vehicle tracked, an armored amphibious vehicle that could drive up onto the beach. 30 Marines crammed into the LVT, packed shoulder to shoulder. The vehicle smelled of diesel fuel, sweat, and fear. The LVT circled offshore with dozens of others, waiting for the signal to head to the beach. John could see the island clearly now, a barren, ugly volcanic rock rising from the ocean, Mount Suribachi dominating the southern end. Smoke and dust from the bombardment still obscured much of the island. Reports were coming in from the first waves. Light resistance, Marines advancing. Some officers were already calling it easier than expected. Then everything changed. At approximately 0915 hours, just 15 minutes after the first Marines landed, the Japanese opened fire. They had waited deliberately, allowing the beaches to fill with Marines and equipment before revealing their positions. When they opened fire, it was with everything. Artillery, mortars, rockets, machine guns, anti-tank guns, all pre-sighted on the beaches. The effect was catastrophic. Marines were cut down by the hundreds. Landing craft were hit and exploded. Tanks and amphibious vehicles were destroyed. The beach became a killing zone. John's LVT hit the beach at 0930 hours, right into the middle of the firestorm. The rear ramp of the LVT dropped. John jumped out into shallow water and ran toward the beach. The beach was made of black volcanic sand, soft, loose sand that made running difficult. Every step sank 6 inches deep. It was like running in loose gravel. Japanese fire was everywhere. Machine gun bullets kicked up geysers of sand. Mortar shells exploded in clusters. Artillery rounds landed among the landing craft still in the water. The noise was overwhelming. Explosions, screaming, the roar of aircraft overhead, the hammering of machine guns. John ran forward, following training. Get off the beach, find cover, establish a defensive position. His 30 Marines followed him. spread out in a loose formation. They made about 50 yards inland before Japanese machine gun fire from a concrete pillbox pinned them down. Marines dug behind a low ridge, actually the first terrace of Mount Suribachi slopes. The sand provided some cover, but they couldn't advance. John looked around, assessing. Tanks were supposed to be supporting the infantry, but the tanks were stuck. The volcanic sand was too soft. The tank treads just spun, digging deeper. Without tank support, the Marines couldn't advance against the fortified Japanese positions. John made a decision that would cost him his life. John stood up, completely exposing himself to Japanese fire, and ran toward the nearest tank. Machine gun bullets tore through the air around him. One bullet grazed his leg. He felt it burn across his thigh, but didn't stop. He reached the tank and pounded on the hull. The tank commander opened the hatch. John shouted over the noise, "Follow me. I'll guide you through." The tank commander hesitated. He could see his tank was stuck, saw the soft sand. But John's rank insignia showed he was a gunnery sergeant, and his eyes showed he knew what he was doing. The tank commander nodded. John ran alongside the tank, directing it toward firmer ground. He learned on Guadalcanal how to read terrain, how to find the solid paths through difficult ground. The volcanic sand wasn't uniform. Some areas were firm, others soft. John guided the tank through the firm areas. Japanese machine guns tracked John as he ran. Bullets hit the sand at his feet. Mortar shells landed nearby. One explosion threw John off his feet, but he got up and kept running. Behind him, other tanks saw what he was doing and followed. With John's guidance, 5 tanks made it off the beach onto firmer ground. With tank support, the Marines could advance. John ran back toward his platoon's position to organize the advance. He was breathing hard, his leg bleeding from the grazed wound, but he was grinning. He'd done it. He'd gotten the tanks moving. That's when he saw the Japanese pillbox. The pillbox was a reinforced concrete bunker about 50 yards from John's position. A machine gun inside was firing at the Marines pinned down on the beach, killing them systematically. The tank couldn't hit it. The angle was wrong. Infantry couldn't charge it. They'd be cut down before they got close. John grabbed his demolition satchel, a canvas bag filled with explosives and fuses, and said to his Marines, "I'm taking out that pillbox. Cover me." One of his Marines, a young private named Steve Evanson, said, "Sergeant, that's suicide. You'll never make it." John replied, "Then you better shoot straight and keep their heads down." John ran toward the pillbox in a zigzag pattern, trying to make himself a harder target. His Marines fired at the pillbox, keeping the Japanese gunner suppressed. Japanese fire came from other positions. John could hear bullets snapping past his head. He covered the 50 yards in about 8 seconds and threw himself against the side of the pillbox, out of the machine gun's firing arc. He pulled grenades from his belt, armed them, and threw them through the firing slit. The grenades exploded inside the pillbox. The machine gun fell silent. John stood up and waved his platoon forward. It was 1,015 hours. John Basilone had been on Iwo Jima for 45 minutes. He had guided tanks off the beach under fire. He had destroyed a pillbox single-handedly. He had saved dozens of Marines' lives. He had about 15 minutes left to live. John's platoon advanced about 100 yards inland, moving through a nightmare landscape of volcanic sand, shell craters, burning vehicles, and dead Marines. The beach behind them was chaos. Thousands of Marines trying to get inland, Japanese fire coming from positions all across the island. John's objective was to establish a defensive position and set up his machine guns to support the advance toward Mount Suribachi. He found a slight depression in the ground that offered some cover and ordered his machine gun crews to set up there. That's when the Japanese mortar barrage hit. Japanese observers on Mount Suribachi had perfect views of the beach and the American advance. They directed mortar fire with precision, a barrage of mortar shells, probably from 81 millimeters or 120 millimeters mortars, fell directly on John's position. The first shells killed 3 Marines instantly. John was throwing himself toward cover when a mortar round landed approximately 10 feet from him. The explosion threw John Basilone through the air. Shrapnel tore through his body, his chest, his arms, his neck. He was dead before he hit the ground. 4 other Marines were killed by the same barrage. Corporal Charles Chuck Tatum, PFC Steve Evanson, PFC Richard Grantham, and PFC George Gallas, young Marines who had trained under John, who looked up to him, who had followed him onto that volcanic island. When the smoke cleared, the Marines who survived the barrage found John's body. He was lying on his back, his eyes open, blood pooling in the black volcanic sand beneath him. He was 28 years old. He had been married for 7 months. He had been on Iwo Jima for 1 hour and 15 minutes. John's body was carried off the beach by Marines from his platoon. They refused to let corpsmen handle him. He was their sergeant, and they would carry him themselves. They placed his body in a temporary grave on the beach, marked with his rifle stuck bayonet first into the sand, his helmet on top. The battle for Iwo Jima continued for another 35 days. The Marines captured Mount Suribachi on February 23rd, 4 days after John died. The famous photograph of Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi's summit became one of the most iconic images of World War II. But John Basilone never saw it. Of the 70,000 Marines who landed on Iwo Jima, 6,821 were killed and 19,217 wounded. Casualty rates of nearly 40%. Almost every Japanese defender fought to the death. The battle was so horrific that Admiral Chester Nimitz said, "Among the Americans who served on Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue." After the battle, John's body was exhumed from the temporary grave and prepared for burial. He was initially interred in the 5th Marine Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima. After the war, his remains were returned to the United States at his family's request. On April 5, 1948, John Basilone was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery in Arlington, Virginia, with full military honors. His grave is in Section 12, Site 384. The headstone reads, John Basilone, Gunnery Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, World War II, Medal of Honor, November 4, 1916 to February 19, 1945. For his actions on Iwo Jima, John Basilone was awarded the Navy Cross posthumously. The citation reads, "For extraordinary heroism while serving as a leader of a machine gun section, Company C, 1st Battalion, 27th Marines, 5th Marine Division, in action against enemy Japanese forces on Iwo Jima in the Volcano Islands, February 19, 1945. Shrewdly gauging the tactical situation shortly after landing when his company's advance was held up by the concentrated fire of a heavily fortified Japanese blockhouse, Gunnery Sergeant Basilone boldly defied the smashing bombardment of heavy-caliber fire to work his way around the flank and up to a position directly on top of the blockhouse, and then, attacking with grenades and demolitions, single-handedly destroyed the entire hostile strong point and its defending garrison. Continuing to press forward, he piloted one of our tanks through a minefield of safety, despite the intense hostile fire directed against him. When an American tank was trapped in enemy minefields under intense mortar and artillery barrages, Gunnery Sergeant Basilone, on his own initiative, daringly defied the deadly blast and succeeded in directing the besieged vehicle to safety. By his tireless efficiencies and inspiring leadership during the advance from the beach, he contributed materially to the success of the operation. Gunnery Sergeant Basilone's courageous actions, in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service, were an inspiration to his comrades and reflect the highest credit upon himself and the Marine Corps. John Basilone became the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross, the two highest decorations for valor in the U.S. military. When Lena Basilone received a telegram informing her of John's death, she was working in the mess hall at Camp Pendleton. The telegram was dated February 27, 1945, 8 days after John was killed. Military telegrams were always delayed, always impersonal, always devastating. The telegram read, "The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you that your husband, Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, USMCR, was killed in action on 19 February in performance of his duty and service of his country." Lena collapsed. Other women Marines caught her before she hit the floor. She was taken to her barracks and sedated. For 3 days, she couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't function. She had been married for 7 months and 19 days. She was a widow at age 30. Lena received John's personal effects several weeks later. His wedding ring, his dog tags, letters she had written to him that he carried to Iwo Jima. She also received his Medal of Honor and Navy Cross, sent by the Marine Corps with a letter praising John's sacrifice. Lena kept everything. She never remarried. For the rest of her life, 54 years, she kept John's medals in her home, wore his wedding ring on a chain around her neck, and spoke about him to anyone who asked. She attended military ceremonies honoring John's memory. She visited his grave at Arlington every year on February 19th, the anniversary of his death. She corresponded with Marines who had served with John, both on Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, collecting their stories and memories. In 1981, Lena attended the dedication of the USS Basilone DD-824, a destroyer commissioned in John's honor. She broke the champagne bottle on the ship's bow and said, "John would have been proud." Lena Basilone died on June 11, 1999, at age 85. She died of a stroke at her home in California, surrounded by photographs of John. In her will, she requested to be buried next to John at Arlington National Cemetery. On June 17, 1999, Lena was laid to rest in grave site 384A, directly next to John. Her headstone reads, Lena M. Basilone, Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, Women's Reserve, July 12, 1913 to June 11, 1999. John and Lena Basilone rest together at Arlington. They had 7 months of marriage. They have eternity together now. John Basilone's legacy extends far beyond the medals he earned. His story has become a symbol of the highest ideals of military service: courage, duty, sacrifice, and leadership in the front. The Marines have honored his memory in numerous ways. Camp Basilone at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, was named in his honor. USS Basilone DD-824, a Gearing-class destroyer, served from 1949 to 1977. The Basilone Memorial Parade is held annually in Raritan, New Jersey, the largest Memorial Day parade in the state. Drawing over 100,000 attendees, a bronze statue of John stands in Raritan's town square. His Medal of Honor is displayed at the National Museum of the Marine Corps. A stretch of Highway 35 in New Jersey is designated the Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone Memorial Highway. In 2010, HBO produced The Pacific, a 10-part miniseries about the Marine Corps' Pacific War. 3 episodes focus extensively on John Basilone, depicting both his heroism at Guadalcanal and his death at Iwo Jima. Actor John Seda portrayed John with respect and authenticity. The series introduced John's story to millions who had never heard of him. But perhaps John's most important legacy is in Marine Corps training. Every Marine who goes through machine gun school learns about John Basilone. His actions at Guadalcanal are studied as a tactical case study in defensive operations. His ammunition runs under fire are taught as examples of leadership and initiative. His refusal to accept safety is held up as embodiment of the Marine ethos. Leaders eat last. Leaders lead from the front. Leaders never ask their Marines to do something they wouldn't do themselves. On October 24th to 25th, 1942, one Marine with 2 machine guns and 15 men held against 3,000 Japanese soldiers attacking through jungle darkness and rain. For 8 hours, he fired machine guns until the barrels melted, cleared jams with his bare hands until his skin burned off, crawled through enemy lines 3 times to resupply ammunition, and refused to retreat even when his position was overrun. He killed an estimated 300 to 400 enemy soldiers and saved Henderson Field, turning the tide of the Guadalcanal campaign. For this, he earned the Medal of Honor and the right to never fight again. He refused that right. He could have stayed home, safe and comfortable, for the rest of the war. Instead, he insisted on returning to combat because he couldn't ask Marines to fight if he wasn't willing to fight himself. On February 19, 1945, he guided tanks off the beach at Iwo Jima under withering fire, destroyed a Japanese pillbox single-handedly, and led his Marines forward until a mortar shell killed him 75 minutes after he landed. For this, he earned the Navy Cross posthumously. John Basilone is the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. But statistics don't capture his legacy. The numbers: 300-plus kills at Guadalcanal, tanks guided at Iwo Jima, lives saved, are impressive but incomplete. John Basilone's real legacy is the example he set, that heroism isn't a single act but a choice you make every day. That duty means more than survival. That leaders must lead from the front, always. That you never ask your men to do what you won't do yourself. Some call it foolish that John returned to combat when he could have stayed home. Others call it the purest form of heroism. John would have called it simply being a Marine. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. October 25th, 1942, dawn. Guadalcanal. 38 dead Japanese soldiers lie in front of 2 machine gun positions. One Marine stands among the carnage, hands burned, uniform soaked in blood. That Marine is John Basilone, who has just held against impossible odds. He has earned the right to go home and never fight again. He will refuse that right. February 19th, 1945, 1,030 hours. Iwo Jima. A mortar shell lands on black volcanic sand. When the smoke clears, 5 Marines lie dead. One is Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, who returned to combat when he could have stayed safe, who died leading from the front because that's where Marines belong. That is Manila John. John Basilone, 1916 to 1945. Gunnery Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. Medal of Honor, Navy Cross. The only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both. I'm a plain soldier. I want to be with my boys. Rest in peace, Manila John. Mission accomplished. Henderson Field saved. Iwo Jima secured. Duty fulfilled. Semper Fi, Marine.